Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the results of my empirical research on the impact of housing status on the labor market, on labor market outcomes. And I'm William Chan, and this is a collaboration with my colleague Richard Wong. Both of us are from the University of Hong Kong. Before we get to the data and the results and the empirical model, a few words about Hong Kong, in case you're not familiar with the place. It's a small place. The area of Hong Kong is 1,100 square kilometer, relatively small, but we have a large, the percentage of land developed is relatively low as well. Less than 25% of this small piece of land is developed. However, we have a large population, 7.15 million in 2012. That was our last census. So the population is actually larger than the total population of Bulgaria, I think. So, as a result, we have a very high density of population, 6,600 persons per square kilometer, and it puts a lot of pressure on the housing resources. And that's one area in which we see massive intervention by the government in the market. I mean, Hong Kong is known for its free market, but certainly in the housing sector, that's not the case. The government is heavily involved in the supply, particularly in the supply of residential units to the market. And that is immediately apparent from the following figures. In 1985, the public rental people living in public rental units account for more than 40% of the population. So let's see. Okay, so 40.8%, more than 40% of the population lived in public rental units, and over the years that has decreased. As you can see, as you go down the column, you can see that it has decreased somewhat, but that's because the government is encouraging ownership. So it's also supplying units, residential units for sale to the market. And if you add up, so you can see that the percentage of people living in public ownership units, it's increasing. If you add them up, you can see that the percentage of population living in public housing, whether it is purchased or rental, is more or less stable at around more than 40%. So very heavy government intervention in this market. And one thing you should know about the public housing system in Hong Kong is that it is there's a lot of rigidity there. In terms of the rental system, people have to wait for many years to get their units. When it's their turn, when their turn comes up, when a person's turn comes up in after waiting for many years, they get a take it or leave it offer. They don't get to choose where they want to live. So the government comes up with a certain unit, it's offered to the person, do you want it? If the person doesn't want it because it's too far away from where they want to live, then, well, tough luck. They're back in the list, wait for some other time. But so basically, there's not much choice. And once they enter the system, once they accept a certain unit, it's almost impossible to transfer, to move within the system. So you're stuck in that unit, more or less, until you exit the system. So there's a lot of geographic rigidity in there. Similar restrictions on the resale of the public ownership units. There are restrictions on resale. You can't sell it right away, and even when you sell, even when you're allowed to sell it, the government would be recouping a lot of the profit from appreciation. So, which means that the incentive to sell the unit and enter the private market is relatively low. So, in both cases, and whether it's rental or purchased. There's a lot of rigidity in this public housing system. Now, how is such rigidity going to affect labor market performance? Now, Oswald, in a number of papers, suggested that any rigidity in terms of housing decisions would have a negative impact on labor market performance. He was specifically referring to home ownership, but the same analysis can be applied to public housing, since it also imposes a lot of rigidity and reduces geographic mobility. So same argument there, public housing would tend to result in lower rigidity and therefore worse labor market performances. Indeed, this has been checked out in a number of empirical analysis. There are these studies using British data and also Australian data, and by and large, the predictions are substantiated. So public housing tenants in public housing units do tend to perform worse in the labor market. Nevertheless, there's this cross-country analysis which shows that the impact, the magnitude of the impact, really depends on the differences. Would really be different across countries, which is understandable because different countries would have different criteria, right? Eligibility criteria and different terms in terms of the program. So if we want to find out, if we want to know what's the impact of a certain housing program in a certain country, there's no substitute for doing your own research using that country's specific data. And that's what we're doing. I mean, in Hong Kong, there's not a whole lot of study on this, and this is the first attempt to do this empirically. Now, we use primarily census data, so from 1976 to 2010, and we focus on male heads of households simply because their labor supply behavior are easier to analyze, and we restrict our sample to those male heads of household ages 20 to 65. Now I want to skip these summary statistics, but I do want to show you some distribution of population and the jobs. Now Hong Kong, the urban core consists of Kowloon and Hong Kong Island. You can see that the urban core is a relatively small area compared to the entire Hong Kong. Much of it is the New Territories and outlying islands. Those are more rural. The following table shows that the distribution of jobs have not changed by too much over the years. In 1996, if you add up the percentage of jobs in Hong Kong Island and Kowloon, you see that it is 81%. If you look at 2011, it's still 81%. The jobs have not moved. Most of the jobs still remain in the urban core. But that's not the same with the population. If you look at the population, percentage of population, the urban population in 1976, add them up, 91%. But by 2011, urban population has decreased to 58%. So over 30 years, urban population in percentage terms has decreased by more than 30%. So there's very massive migration to outlying areas, and that has to increase commuting. And our analysis is try to analyze how this increase in commuting, in particular, the rigidity, how the rigidity of a public housing system contributes to how that would impact labor market performance. And now, the empirical model can be summarized by this very simple reduced form regression equation. On the right, on the left-hand side, we have this dependent variable, which is a measure of labor market performance. And on the right-hand side, yeah, okay, we have time trend, and X is a vector of personal characteristics. Y would be macroeconomic variables, and H here is the housing status of the person in question, and we have a random term. And the following gives you some details as to what each variable would be. We have two variables, outcome variables, that we to capture the labor market performance, labor force participation, and unemployment. And the personal characteristics, all the usual suspects. that would affect labor supply behavior. So marital status, age squared, years of schooling squared, etc., etc. And why? We're including only one macroeconomic variable. That would be per capita percentage increase in per capita real consumption. That's to capture the real interest rate, and that in turn is to capture the intertemporal substitution effect that affects the labor supply behavior. And age would be a set of dummies for ownership of residential units. The default types. So if the dummy is equal to 0, it means that we're looking at private renters. In particular, we want to focus on the impact of being in a public rental unit on the labor market performance. Now, we estimate this both by OLS and Probert, basically the same results. Now, there's one problem with, and the prediction of a model is that, well, since rigidity reduces, would have a negative impact on labor market performance, we would expect labor force participation to be lower for those living in public rental tenancy, public rental units, whereas unemployment would be greater. Now, one problem with estimating this equation by OLS is that the housing status may not be exogenous, may not actually be exogenous, because people may decide on whether to accept a housing unit, a public rental unit, on the basis of whether it is conveniently located. So when a person is given an offer of a public unit, he may not accept the offer if it's too far away. Therefore, housing status can be endogenous. So what to do? Now, in our particular case, the census also asks a question of the subject of whether they have moved in the past 5 years. Now, if it's reasonable to think that housing status may be endogenous at the time of survey, but if a person has not moved, if has already entered the public housing system 5 years before, or more than 5 years before the time of the survey, of the census, then it is reasonable to assume that their status, housing status at that point, is quite exogenous. Okay? So in particular, for this group of persons, we can kind of maintain the exogeneity of housing status. So running OLS, we get these results. Perhaps we can first focus on the entire sample, results from the entire sample. And you can see that there's I want to focus on save time. We want to focus on the first row. So for all men, the labor market participation rate of public renters is indeed lower by almost 3%, 3 percentage points here. If we restrict our attention to those who have not moved and therefore whose housing status is relatively exogenous, then we get a slightly more negative result, as we would expect. Okay? And, but nevertheless, all these estimates are more or less in the same ballpark, which means that there's not that much of a difference. So there's an alternative way of estimating the regression. Instead of dividing the sample, we could use the entire sample, but add a dummy. Okay? Dummy for whether the person has moved within the last 5 years, and also an interaction term here between the moving within the last 5 years and being a public rental. And as you can see, the results are not that different. The results are not that different. And in particular, these coefficients, these dummies, are not significant, which means that actually the decisions are not that exogenous, are not that endogenous. Okay, they're not that different. Those who have or have not moved in the past 5 years. Apparently, the housing decision is determined by something else. Okay, in this case, because housing is so expensive in Hong Kong, if they get a chance to move into a private or public rental housing, they will accept it. Okay, so this table gives the results for unemployment. Okay, again, focusing on the first row, you can see that there's a significant negative effect of living in a public rental unit on unemployment. So those who live in public housing rental units tend to have a higher rate of unemployment. We also test the results using alternative data source. This is GHS, General Household Survey. It is kind of like current population survey in the US. It's conducted more regularly, but with less information. So we don't know whether they have moved in the last 5 years or not. Again, you can see that the estimates are in the same ballpark as what we have seen before. So what can we conclude? Labor force participation among public housing rental tenants lower than among private tenants by around 3 percentage points. And unemployment is higher by 1 percentage point. Now, keep in mind that the average unemployment rate throughout the sampling period in Hong Kong is just 3.5%. So this contributes to 1 percentage point of that. That's very significant. And Hong Kong has been said that Hong Kong is the best city in the world for commuters simply because it is so compact and we have a relatively efficient mass transit system. But still, in Hong Kong, we see a significant negative effect as a result of this rigidity. So you can imagine in another place where transportation is less convenient, that you can expect even a larger negative impact. Okay, that's all I'd like to say. Questions?